Hello, Sterile Processing University presents Issues and Challenging in Sterile Processing, a podcast conversation. My name is Jason, and I'm basically a surgical tech and sterile processing tech. I'm certified in both. I've had 30 years experience in perioperative services. I spent my career, started off in sterile processing. I also then switched over to the operating room for a while as a surgical tech, kind of bounced back and forth for a while. And then I'd say about 2006, I decided to start sterile processing leadership. Um, and then about 2015, I met my co-host here, Nancy Chauvin. I met her, and I had to learn all over again because Nancy is just incredible. After my relearn, I think I started to work with Nancy in consulting and education, and together now we both work for Sterile Processing University. And we really gonna kind of bring you guys a new level of podcasts, very different from I think anything you're going to see. This is definitely not a podcast of where you're going to just listen to us lecture and then you're going to get a CEU. I'm sorry, there's no CEUs. This is just a plain conversation, but you're also going to learn a lot. Nancy?
Well, I started out as a registered nurse, and I did that for a number of years. And then in 1980, I accepted a job in a central supply department, as it was called at that time. A friend of mine had recommended me for the position, and the only requirement was that you were a nurse and you knew how to read a budget, which I could do. Once I was hired and I got into the department, I knew I was in deep trouble. I said, I have no idea what's going on here. I had no idea what this equipment would, never heard the word ethylene oxide, scared the dickens out of me. And I realized very quickly that I had a lot to learn. And the thing that scared me even more was that the staff knew nothing either. When I would ask them questions, they couldn't tell me why. They just said, well, this is what we were told to do. Well, my mother used to say, if somebody tells you to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge, are you going to do it? Got to be a rationale for it. And I'm one of those people, if I don't understand something, it makes me very nervous. I have to understand it. So I dedicated myself to going to every single seminar and read every single article that I could find to learn more about sterile processing. And that has really been my thrust over the years, because I feel if I know more, then I can share that with other people, because I have the ability to get it down on a very, very basic level. There's a lot of information out there, but it's presented on a collegiate level. And we're trying to reach the technicians. And some of you might know that I was the founder of the certification board for sterile processing. And when we were doing our formative studies before we set out to do our first exam, we found that the average reading level for a sterile processing technician was 5th to 8th grade. Well, how much information out there is on that level? Very little. Now, we know there's certain things you can't change, like the names of microbes, that's it. Their name is their name. But there's a lot of other things that we have to get it down on a level so they understand it, because it is absolutely true. When somebody understands why they have to do something, they're going to do it. But very often it's presented, Amy says to do this. Okay, there may be a reason why, but it's not presented that way to the employees. They just said, this is what you have to do. I always made sure they understood the why, because when they understood the why, then it was behooving to them to do it. Otherwise, I'd say to him, well, if you knew you had to do it, why didn't you do it?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's why it's important.
And I think it's very important also for the listeners to know, Nancy is currently, contributes to Amy, writing the Amy standards. And how long have you been doing that, Nancy?
Uh, Over 25 years, I was first assigned to be an AMY representative to the now defunct American Society for Healthcare Central Service Personnel. And I was very impressed with the process. And believe it, I am a firm believer that every sterile processing manager should be a member of AMY. Why? Because you can become a committee member and actually have input into the documents. And that's how you learn. A lot of what I learned from the AMY meetings, because you have manufacturers, you have FDA people, you have consultants, you have infection prevention people, operating room people. It goes across a large continuum. And everyone has input into the documents, but it's not a free for all. If you don't like one of the statements, you have to put in your comments why, what's wrong with it, and then B, what do you recommend we change? And then where is your reference to substantiate that change? So it's really a very, very good process. And I recommend this to people all the time. You can join as an individual member for $100. And as a manager, that really is not a lot of money considering what you learn. And also, you can serve on any committee that you want to. And once you participate in that committee, when the document is done, you do get a complimentary copy. So there are advantages to that. But I cannot say enough for the advantages of joining AMY and participating. Now, I also have to add that over the years, in addition to implementing or developing the certification board for sterile processing, which I headed up until 2020, I learned that there are many, many things that we do that we don't document very well. And in my own health system, there were times where I had to investigate where maybe a patient claimed that something happened to them, and we'd have to go through and do an investigation. And it started me down the path of legal consulting. And that's a whole nother issue, because I have an educational program. It's called Do What You Document and Document What You Do. Because too often we're afraid of documentation. Well, let me tell you, the only thing you have to be afraid of is being sued if you don't document.
Yes.
Because, if you can't prove that you did something, then it didn't happen. Many times in a court of law, I will be challenged by an attorney that'll say to me, well, how do you know they didn't put the pressure cap on the scope, and that's why it got damaged? I said, because it's supposed to be documented. And they said, well, just because they didn't document it doesn't mean that they didn't do it. I said, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the point. People think, well, it's like Big Brother watching, or this is a pain in the neck. It's much more of a pain in the neck if you get any type of a lawsuit. And you could be completely, not negligible and didn't do anything wrong. But if you can't prove it, then you're going to be found wrong. That's the problem. So all of these things have just evolved over the years as I got more involved with sterile processing, which led me to do a lot of our online education and the textbooks, which we'll talk about later. But there's just so much education that's needed now. But the important thing is it has to be on a reading level that people understand. When we did certification, we learned that it's a 5th to 8th grade reading level. And while you can't change the name of the microbes, their name is their name, like Bacillus theathermophilus. Everybody has a tough time with that one. But everything else, you can get down on a level that people really understand. If they don't understand it, they're not going to remember it. If they don't remember it, they're not going to do it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that what you just said was pretty interesting in the sense of I really don't think people get everybody gets CEUs, but I don't think people get the legal part of it taught to them. And I think that's where listeners here are going to see in each, we're going to have a podcast every 2 weeks, have a conversation where people are going to learn the legalities of things, which I think is very important. I think that helps sometimes more than just, basically reading the standards or reading, the IFUs. Also understand what can legally happen to you and your facility. um, well, today we're going to talk about surgical instrument spotting and or staining and the impact that it has on the operating room staff.
Well, this is something that has been going on for a very long time, and we just ignored it. I'll be honest. If something looked clean, it went through. Sometimes even that isn't a good process. We have to really look at what are the root causes of having spotted instruments, stained instruments, but it even goes beyond that. What about instruments with instrument marking tape that can fall off inside of a patient's incision when they're using the instrument in the operating room because the tape is so dehydrated? Or you'll see the residue from tape that fell off, but nobody bothered to clean the adhesive material off. There's rusting. I have pictures, thousands of pictures of instruments that never should have left sterile processing. And that is the key to a quality control program. The key to quality control is find your mistakes. We're all human. We're going to make mistakes, but find them while it's still in the department. That's the essence of it. If you have a good quality control system in your department, those things aren't going to leave and wind up in the operating room where it can cause a delay of care, surgeon dissatisfaction, and what have you. These are things that we really have to address. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're going to talk about this today. What are some of the problems and what can we do about it?
Yeah. So I guess maybe the first thing we should jump into is really, because I think a lot of people don't understand this, is how to tell the difference between a spot or a stain.
Right. Well, when your instruments should look as good as they did the day you purchased them. That's the first thing. And if you take care of your instruments, they can last 20 years or more. A lot of things can happen to them. Now, some of them happen outside of SPD. Something gets bent when it shouldn't get bent. They use a scissor to cut material instead of tissue. But we're talking about things that occur in sterile processing. Now, there are many things that can affect the appearance of an instrument. And we finally have a document to help us with that, and that's ST-108, the water quality document from Amy. Everyone should have a copy of this. Now, the document's intent was not to make water quality experts out of sterile processing people. But sterile processing does play an important role, because if the instruments coming from your department have anything other than an appearance of a new instrument, then we have to find out what's happening. We can't mask it. I just had a phone call before we started this from a colleague who said that she was working with a facility and they were getting stains on their tray liners. So what did they do? They went out and bought different tray liners. That's like putting makeup on a pimple. You still have the pimple. You have to find the cause of the problem.
And I can tell you how many times I've had OR people say, like, can we just change the color from white to something else?
Yeah. So you can't see it. We're always looking for the quick fix. And whether it's cleaning or anything else, it's the worst thing you can do. In my own department one time, we were having problems with positive BIs. And the first thing that came up was, change the BI. There's something wrong with it. No, the BI did its job. There's something wrong with the sterilizer. So, we have to look at everything. And I always tell people, and Jason, you were on a number of projects where we had to do this, where there was spotting and staining. We have to look at what are we seeing? And maybe we could see a couple of slides, Jason, to demonstrate. Do you have a couple of slides that we can put up there?
Yes, we do.
All right. So in this first one, you're going to see rusting and pitting. Now, pitting, basically on the left, is where you get those little black dots. And that's usually due to alkaline detergents or bleach or something of that nature that obviously the instrument should not have been subjected to. Now, the problem is your instrument should have a smooth, intact surface. When you get pitting, you now have all these little pock marks where microorganisms, blood, and body fluids can accumulate, which cannot be removed during cleaning and can interfere with sterilization. On the right, you'll see some rusting also. And on this, the rusting could be due to any number of things. The instruments being put away while they're still wet, instrument quality. This is a surgical grade instrument, you can see from the name, but sometimes we mix up Pakistani instruments with operating room grade instruments. And so any rusting could be transmitted to them. But again, when you have rusting, you no longer have a smooth, intact surface. That instrument is not considered safe.
Mm-hmm.
We have another one to show.
Yep, there's one for rusting.
Yeah, now this one, you see, it's not only rusting, but there's also pitting. So again, why would this even be sent to the operating room? Because this is not in any manner, shape, or form considered safe to use.
You know, and it's funny because, you know, again, being on both sides, you know, you got the SPD person that, you know, they get told, like, this is the only one we have in the building. It cannot be missing. You have to do it. And then, you know, I always feel bad because then the sterile processing techs, like, even though some of them are very good to say, I can't use this, but they're just put in a corner to it where they're like, they have to put it in.
Well, but, you know, now we have to look at the other side.
Yeah.
In the operating room, in a court of law, the surgeon has the right to assume that everything brought into his operating room is safe to use.
Mm-hmm.
So the surgeon's off the hook. That they have no idea. The operating room director then has the responsibility because she's allowing that item to go into the operating room. Now, operating room director is not in the OR. The circulator is. The circulator would be the one to be the traffic cop. But somebody has to inform that surgeon. If they don't, the surgeon's off the hook if that patient gets an infection.
Yep.
Because the surgeon was not advised. And I will bet you dollars to donuts that if you said to that surgeon, hey, if you go ahead and use that instrument and your patient gets an infection, you can get sued. They're going to say, I want no part of this. Get me something else. I'll use something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that for a fact. I've had that on more than one occasion where we actually had a nurse come down to sterile processing, and I happened to be there that day, stopped the washer, took the instruments out, brought them up to the OR. And the sterile processing staff told me. So I went up to the OR. I went to the exact room, and they were just finishing up the case. And I stuck my head in the room and I said to the circulator, I said, who went down to sterile processing and stopped the washer? She said, oh, I sent down the orderly. I said, no, you have to understand something. Number one, you don't come into our department and play with our equipment, just like we wouldn't do it in the operating room. Number two, those instruments were not safe to use. They had not even been finished cleaning. She said, well, the surgeon wants to do his next case and we can't delay it. I said, really? So I called the surgeon over. I said, are you aware that these instruments have not been properly cleaned? He said, what do you mean? I said, someone came down and told the staff that they had to have them. They stopped the washer and they sent them up here. He said, well, they told me they were clean. I said, no, I said they were put in a washer. They were not done with washing. I said, the problem is if you go ahead and use them, I said, I've now informed you that those instruments were not safe to use. I said, now there's a couple of things you could do. You can wait, I'll take them back. We'll do the complete cleaning. And then if they want to go ahead and do immediate use, you certainly could do that. Or you can wait, we'll take them back, we'll prioritize them, we'll get them washed, we'll get them sterilized, we'll get them back here. We should be able to get them back in about 2.5 hours. Or number three, you could go ahead and use them. But if you do, I'm filing an incident report that I informed you they were not safe to use. He looked at me and he said, I'll go wait in the doctor's lounge. Let me know when they're ready.
See, we need a little bit more of that.
But he had the information he needed.
Uh-huh.
You know how I hear this from surgeons all the time. I was at a major facility, and you worked at there also, Jason, where we were meeting with the trauma team. And we had some issues that the trauma team wanted us to correct. And one of the things was, they tell us they're going to be ready in 2 hours and we don't get them for 6 to 8 hours. I said, who's telling you you're getting trauma instruments in 2 hours? Well, the nurse in the room. I said, what do they know? I said, they don't know what we do. I said, if you want to know what it takes, come to sterile processing, 5 minutes. I'll give you a crash course. I said, the best we can do is 5 hours. I said, and that would be if we had an open sterilizer and everything went right.
Yeah.
He said, well, all they have to do is tell me that. He said, I only get annoyed because they tell me 2 hours. I said, well, anytime you want the actual information, you call sterile processing and we will give you the information. But this is the problem. I would never go to the operating room and say to them, hey, you've got to do that total knee in an hour and a half because we're not going to be here after that. We can't. They look at me and say, get out of here. You have nothing to do with how we run the operating room. Well, it works both ways.
Yeah.
It works the same way with sterile processing. So, we've got to get over this and do a lot better job of educating even the operating room. Yes. I'm a firm believer that come on and spend some time. We used to have the OR nurses had to rotate down to sterile processing. And it was for a couple hours. We would give them maybe a half hour in decontam, a half hour in prep and packaging, a half hour in sterilization. I can tell you 99% of the time, when they left the department, they said to me, we will never call down here and bother you people again because this place is nuts. They had no idea. Because they don't realize that you have labor and delivery, the emergency room, the floors, everybody calling you for supplies and things that they need because everybody thinks they're your own customer. And that's okay. But they also have to understand that we're just one department and we have to keep all of the customers satisfied. And very often we have to do like a triage and say, who's going to get it first?
Yeah. And I'll have to say, I think I noticed prior to COVID, the operating room staff was pretty much eliminated from sterile processing. But after COVID, and I don't know if it had to do with because basically they needed to get their hours in, but they started to return more. Like the operating room was slowing down, I guess, and returning the staff were saying like, oh, go help sterile processing in the places that I was working with, which was nice. But I guess also that, as much as we want, them there to learn, I guess sometimes they get challenged with staffing themselves.
Oh yeah.
But I am seeing a return of that, and I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. All right. So here's a photo of spotting. Now it almost looks like, if this could be enlarged, it almost looks like the design on a giraffe. You have these wide areas that are lightly outlined. And the spotting can be differentiated from a stain, if you go to the next slide, by using an eraser. The spots can be removed using an eraser. And if you do that, obviously you have to re-clean the instrument afterwards. But it has to be no destruction of the metal underneath. You may think it's a spot, but if you go to remove the defect and you see that there is corrosion underneath, then you still cannot use it, okay? So that's the differentiation. If you can remove it with an eraser, then it's only a spot, it's not a stain. And then once you clean it, and there are products on the market that, will remove some spotting and staining. Of course, you have to use them as directed. They're acid products, so you don't want to use them all the time. You shouldn't be running them routinely in your washer or anything like that. They can help you with that.
Yeah, and if you're going to use a product, make sure, check with your manufacturer of your instrument that product can be used on it.
Right.
But it's funny you were talking about the, like erasing it and then cleaning it. I can't tell you how many times in the last 30 years, I was watching somebody with an eraser and just going,
I
blowing
know.
on it, and I'm going, "Oh my god."
Well, we talk about that too when we go to sterile storage, and that'll be another whole story. But something drops on the floor, and what's your first reaction to blow on it? Well, that's even worse thing. If you didn't have any bugs on it before, you certainly do now. But then here again are some additional defects that were found on sets that were open. And that's another thing we're going to talk about. What are we doing for quality control? Are you going through and opening sets routinely? I call them instrument audits because you may uncover problems that the staff either ignored or didn't notice, and you can get on it right away. So these are all different things that we have to think about when we think about spotting and staining. But we have to start from the beginning. What are we doing in decontam? There's a company known as the Emergency Care Research Institute, ECRI, and every year they publish the top 10 health hazards in healthcare. And unfortunately, for the past at least 10 years I could remember, something in sterile processing has been on that list. The list for 2026 actually has two things. One is unclear cleaning instructions or non-compliance with cleaning instructions. Definitely a contributor to spotting and staining. And the second thing is failure to identify causes of instrument problems in compliance with ST-108 water quality document. Now, most people aren't even aware that that document exists because, again, if you're a manager in sterile processing, you should know every one of these documents when they're published so you can bring it back to your facility and have them implement it. But it is really important that you start in decontam and look at what you're doing. Look to see if your staff is using the correct detergent. I'll go in and I'll find 6, 7 different detergents. Now, I know when you go to a trade show, they'll offer you samples and everything, but if you bring them back doesn't mean you should use them. Infection prevention is supposed to be aware of any chemicals that are being used in the facility. And if you're using one enzyme detergent for manual cleaning and another one in your washer, are they from different companies? Could they be counteracting each other? Or I'll see people buy the sponges that are already impregnated with an enzyme, and yet they're still using it in a solution with enzymatic detergent. Well, now again, you have 2 enzyme detergents.
That's so common. I can't get over how many times I try to explain that to people, and it just goes right over their head that you're mixing chemicals.
If you want to use a sponge, they make the sponges without any detergent in them. That's fine, but you have to do one or the other. You can't do both.
I'll tell you, you just brought up something really very interesting, though. You said about infection control nurses coming in. I think it's very important to point out, which I know we'll probably go into this more in the next episode, but don't be afraid to educate your infection control person, because a lot of times, especially I'll work with them and they'll say, I know nothing about sterile processing, right? But I think sometimes sterile processing managers or staff don't want to teach them or let them know as much as they need to know because they're afraid to get in trouble. And it's really the complete opposite of that. They really want to help. So, remind them they can get, there's courses they can take, there's certifications, they can get that. It doesn't hurt for them to have your knowledge.
And that's very true, Jason. And I'm seeing more of an interest. I'm going to deviate for a minute. I guess when I was in 1990, I had moved on in sterile processing, and I was at a much larger facility, much more sophisticated facility. And again, it was so much going on in the 90s where we were really ramping up a lot of the documents from Amy. And I found it difficult to keep myself up to date there was so much going on out there because you're running a department, you have a life at home, and you had extracurricular activities such as being members of AMI or professional committees. So in frustration, I decided to start a what I call the sterile processing management course. It was 3 days, and we went over the critical things that people needed to know. And I talked about the different AD documents that we had and what have you. Well, that was in 1990. I am still teaching that course. I update it at least once a year, and it's now up to 4 full days. It goes over every AMI document, plus some things that you need to know as a manager, such as quality assurance, process improvement, doing a staffing, things of that nature that a lot of people need help with, but they don't always get. The other thing that I found is that over the years, we're probably getting about 15 to 20% attendance from infection preventionists because they want to know more. And we do get about 10 to 15% perioperative people. We've had some materials management people, mainly those that have sterile processing report to them. But I have had so many people write back to me and say that it was such a valuable course for them because they were able to pass their Joint Commission survey. They were able to go back and get their policies in alignment with AMI. So, yeah, a lot of people think they know about sterile processing, and we don't try to make operating room directors or infection preventionists sterile processors, but for them to just understand globally what we do and how we impact on what they do. And it's important for them to understand that as well.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's extremely.
So go back to where we were with the cleaning. That's okay. We're going all over. This is another one that I found with staining. This one is really bad. I believe this one had to do with mixing different types of instruments. Now, not the typical where you see the staining from electrolysis, where you take different metal types and put them in, but there was something on these instruments. I don't remember if it was a coating or what. And it's clearly said in the IFU to separate them separately, sterilize them separately. But here again, I'm not pointing fingers. The operating room wanted everything on the same tray so that everything they needed was together, and the staff accommodated that, and the instruments got ruined. So again, this is where we have to do education. I had, and I know every time I have an example, I think it's important. One of my hospitals, at the end, I was vice president of sterile processing. We had 9 hospitals, and I rotated through all of them. And I always happened to be at the hospital that was having a crisis that day. And they had a new tray that was coming in that they were going to trial. And it was actually 2 separate trays. One tray was the instruments, and the other tray was the transducers. And so the operating room called me, and this was we had a great rapport. And they said, guy came in, the rep came in, he said it's 274 minutes pre-back. We're going to send you down the instruments and the IFUs to double check. I said, great. So I'm looking at, instruments, 274 minutes pre-back, no problem. Get it to the transducers, 274 minutes pre-back. Second transducer, 60 minutes, 270 pre-back. And I said, what? This has got to be a typo. I said, even 6 minutes, I could understand, but 60 minutes? So I called the company and I said, I'm challenging this IFU. I said, I've been doing this at that time, 30 years, and I never saw an IFU that had 60 minutes at 270 pre-back. And he said, the FDA required that we give that time because of the design of that particular device. Now, if we had just taken verbatim what the rep said, that everything went 274 minutes, that transducer never would have been safe for the patient. We had to take that transducer off and sterilize it separately. So this is, again, why you need to have that kind of a rapport with the operating room. If they just went ahead and said, well, the rep said it's okay, you're going to wind up with a lot of damage. And that's what happened here. So it's really important that in sterile processing, the manager has to get involved. You may have a supervisor who's really good. And if you trust that supervisor and their knowledge level is there, then they can make those decisions and say to the operating room, no, we can't do these instruments together. And again, if you tell them why, they will understand. If you just say, no, we can't do it, then that's going to be another issue.
So, and you also, if you're a manager and you have a really good supervisor, doesn't mean they have to handle it for you. You still got to be a part of it. And I see a lot of that where they're like, oh, the supervisors got it. Like, it's a team effort. Everybody, when you have these types of problems and issues, everybody should be working together.
Well, again, communication is an important part of all of this. Mm-hmm. If you see something when you're assembling a tray, you've got to say something.
Yeah.
Well, not my job. Yeah, it is your job. So let's go back to decontam again. No, I'm glad you left this because I forgot to put this one in here. I just wanted to show people the impact of not having a good quality control program in SPD. The average cost to use an operating room per hour is $62 a minute or $3,720 per hour. And if your facility has just 4 operating rooms, and SPD causes a delay of just 1 hour a week per OR, that comes to $14,880 a week or $773,760 a year in lost revenue. Now think of what you could do with that money. Maybe buy that tracking system that you've been trying to get. Maybe buy more instruments that you desperately need. But this is a direct result of sterile processing. So we have got to fix this, and whatever it takes. And this was an article that was in the cost of an OR minute, and I put the information on there. Forgot what magazine it was published in, but this was recent information. So actually it was from 12/2020. So it was the most current information I could find. But I think sterile processing people really need to understand the impact of what they do when they fail to do things the right way. Now, let's go back to decontam. So we talked about, detergents, making sure you're only using the appropriate detergents, the ones that are recommended by the instrument manufacturer, your equipment manufacturer. You have to be careful because sometimes with your sonic cleaner, you have to use distilled water and not tap water or utility water. And that's another thing that people don't understand. They think that with the water quality document, they only need reverse osmosis water for their final rinse. You have to make sure that your tap water is meeting the quality standards, because not all tap water is created equal. You could have a lot of minerals in your tap water that's interfering with your detergent. And here you are paying millions of dollars a year for detergent, and it's not working, and you don't even know it. So we've got to make sure that we're using the correct detergents, we're using them in the correct dilution. And that's another issue, is that Amy has identified that we don't rinse instruments at the end of each phase that can result in spotting or staining. So that means when the instruments come to you from the operating room, and we'll assume that they were pre-treated in the operating room, which everybody should be doing right now, they have an enzyme foam or gel product on them. Well, that has to be rinsed off before you do anything.
Yes.
Then you could put them in the sink and do your soaking and your washing. After that, they get rinsed again in utility water. Then if they're going into the sonic, they get rinsed again when they come out of the sonic and before they go into the washer. At every step of the process, they have to be rinsed, and with the quality water that's recommended. We also
just real quick, it's so important to say the difference between rinsing and dunking.
Oh yeah. Well, you see now, and again, now we're going to go into another topic. This is not the whole program. The IFUs are all changing now because of this.
Yeah.
All the IFUs now are being changed. They're saying utility water, how much water, how many rinses. Don't reuse the rinse water. But again, people think because they have a copy of an IFU, it's good forever. We'll
Yes.
do the whole podcast on that because I got a lot of horror stories on that one. But you have to make sure that you're following the AMI standards as well. How are we loading the instruments? I have pictures that show you instruments. No matter what you did, they weren't going to come out clean. They're just completely overloaded. They're on a stringer. If you want to string your instruments, that's another story we could talk about, but I'm not a firm believer in stringing instruments because even if you can string them and they can remain vertical with the jaws open, they don't always fit into your washers that way because of the height that you would need. But why are we doing that? Because once they come into the prep area, we have to unstring them so we can inspect them. And you know what? Because they're strung, people are not doing it.
No, I've worked with some, I've worked at some smaller places in the last few years where you have these like technicians that are so good, like that have been there for so long that they know the sets without the count sheets. So when it's their day decontam, they restring it according to the count sheets because they can remember it.
Wow.
So that the person, when they get another side, it's already strung to the count sheet. So then they're like, oh, why? But it's just like you said, you still got to inspect, and you can't take the whole stringer and just go like this. And,
right.
You have to do it.
Well, not only that, I mean, you have to understand that very often people are using the wrong size stringer.
Yeah.
Whatever stringer they have. And so you're not winding up with the jaws that are open sufficiently to get the detergent in there. An easy way to tell that people are not opening their instruments correctly is how often do you see debris in the box locks? There should not be anything in that joint.
Yep.
And when I see it, that tells me those instruments are not being opened. And so now if I'm in the prep area and I open that instrument and I see it, what do I do with it? I send it back to decontam.
Yes. Not the sink that's in there.
Yeah, if I see brushes and little bowls over on the hand wash sink, that's big trouble. We'll do another one on that too, because that's a very big issue.
So as we're into this, I think we should, because I know we kind of been all over the place, but that's you and I. This is what happens when two people have been in the business forever talking. We go all over the place. Let's break it down to like some simple facts. What causes the spotting and staining so they know how to avoid it?
Well, again, there's many, many reasons for it. Number one, the wrong detergent. Using the detergent improperly, not having processing equipment that's working correctly, or that you're testing it correctly, or that you are interpreting the test correctly. Those tests are very important. And how accurate are the tests you're using to tell you if your washer is working correctly?
Mm-hmm.
There have been tests that have said, the washer was working correctly. And then when a different test or water quality people came in, they found that it wasn't. So, and then you have to look at the quality of instruments that you're using. All of that is part of the decontam area. Then when we get into prep and packaging, we have to look at what packaging materials we're using. Are people making sure the instruments are dry before they put them, before they assemble them? Are they milking their instruments? Because milking does have a benefit in terms of protecting the chromium oxide, a protective layer of your instruments. And then we want to get into sterilization. In terms of sterilization, what is your steam quality? Do we have impurities in our steam? Do we have filters on our steam line? Who's monitoring the filters? I had a problem very early on in my career, and it's a nightmare, but we were getting intermittent BIs, and we couldn't double positive. We couldn't understand why. And it was on one sterilizer, but it was a nightmare because we had to keep recalling the loads and recalling the loads. And so finally, I said, you know what? We're getting everybody in the same room. We got the sterilizer manufacturer, the BI manufacturer, the engineer, and myself. And we said, nobody's leaving the room until we find out what's happening. And we started going down a checklist. And one of the things that came up was, what about the filters on the steam sterilizer? And engineering said, yeah, we have filters. When were they last changed? And they said, 3 months ago, because that's what it said on the box. They said, really? He said, you can't use that as a guide because your water quality could change month to month.
Oh, yeah.
So they went and checked. These filters were so dehydrated that they were falling apart, and the parts of the filter were clogging the steam intermittently, and that's why we were getting intermittent BIs that were positive. Once they changed the filters and they installed gauges on it, so they knew when it reached a certain pressure, that told them the filter had to be changed. They didn't go by the 3 months anymore. They went by the pressure. So these are all things that we have to look at. But again, we are not water quality experts. We have to be responsible for what we could do in terms of the detergents and following the correct processes and the inspection process. The inspection process in prep and packaging is the most important. Do you have a lighted microscope, lighted magnifying glass? And are you using it? I see people that have the handheld ones. I don't like them. I like the ones that sit on the table. We have both hands free, so you can open up that instrument to the fullest extension. Do we make sure that we're checking the serrations, the box locks, that the jaws? All of these things are critical, because this is where we want to find the defect and take care of it before something happens. And then when we find that we have a problem, what are we doing about it? Well, you have a water quality committee, so you could bring this information to your water quality committee. Sterile processing is an important part of the water quality committee, because we are preparing instruments for sterilization. So they are expected to be sterile when they're used. Well, we can only do that if we have a good system in place. And that system includes thorough inspection. And I know people say, well, we don't have the people, we have to do 5 trays an hour, or, we're not meeting the productivity standards. Well, who developed the productivity standards? And is every tray treated the same? Myringotomy tray? Yeah, maybe. But you get into a total joint tray or a trauma tray, you can't do that in 5 hours, not that many trays. So these are all the things that we have to look at. And if it does get through, then we have failed. Mm-hmm. Because if we're doing something wrong, we have all these opportunities to identify it. We have the opportunities in decontam with all the testing we do there. We have the opportunities in prep and packaging with all of our inspections there. And even with sterilization, when the packages come out, do we have spotting or staining on the outside of the package? If we do, we have to reprocess it, and we have to find out why. And that includes with a peel pack. If you have a peel pack with spotting and staining, either on the instrument inside or the peel pack on the outside, why? So these are the things that we are responsible to do. And if we don't do it, then we are going to wind up with instruments going to the operating room. And now the operating room has to make a decision. And it isn't fair to put them in that position, because they have a right to expect that every one of their instruments is going to be safe to use, or we wouldn't have sent it, because we're just as responsible. When we send it to the operating room, we're saying, it's sterile, go ahead and use it. And if we can't stand behind that, that's a problem.
So that's a really good subject to touch for staining, spotting, and staining. I can't tell you how many people I've ran into in the 30 years, or as a sterile processing person, or somebody who's been at the surgical field, because again, your registered nurse, the circulator, is licenses on the line in the room, and it's, they call the shots. But you get some, and it's lack of education. You get some facilities that well, this instrument's stained. Well, if that was the case, then every instrument here is stained and we wouldn't be able to do surgery. So just use it. I've gotten that direction from, circulators. I've seen circulators allow, again, it to be used one day, but then the next day say, no, we can't use this. Um, I really, and I'm not blaming anybody because I know it's education. What I think we should iron out what the definitive line is when you have a stained instrument on your surgical field, because I don't know, as a leader, I get called to the room constantly. Can I use it or not use it? Because sometimes they do want my opinion. And I always, it's no, you got spotting and staining, but I get overridden and overrided, and you know,
It's a very difficult call because, first of all, we can't be responsible for a decision the operating room makes.
yeah,
They want us to do it. I'll never forget one time I got a call that they had a custom knee replacement prosthesis. And they had put in the patient, and when the surgeon, manipulated the knee, it popped up and went on the floor. And so they called me and said, what do we do? I said, you're asking me? I says, the rep in the room? I'm not going to tell you what to do. I didn't make it. And I'm not putting my license and my reputation on the line. Get infection prevention. Well, they don't know what we should do either. I said, I'm sorry, I cannot help you. I don't like leaving people in a lurch like that, but I am not going to tell people what to do because that's what they want to hear.
yes,
Because you cannot justify that. I always give a decision based on, can I justify this in a court of law? And for people who think it's never going to happen to me, I hope it never happens to you. But unfortunately, it happens far too much. You know why we don't know? Because they're settled out of court because nobody wants it to make the papers.
yeah.
Okay.
And
So the operating room,
real quickly, the sterile processing technicians don't know that. Leaders who are watching this know that they're settled out of court, but technicians usually don't know how many lawsuits hospitals actually have that are based in sterile processing in the operating room that get settled out of court.
yeah, exactly. And
Yeah,
I'm not saying all of them have validity to them because we know people like to sue at the drop of a hat. But the point is, there's still going to be a process they're going to go through. And believe me, depositions can be hell on wheels.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in depositions that have taken 8 hours and they just keep hammering and hammering and hammering. And, Judge Judy always says, if you didn't tell a lie, it's not going to be difficult to remember.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you know what you did, then you just keep giving the same answer over and over again. I'm sure I put it on. I'm sure I put it on, or whatever the issue is. But, the problem with, and I've seen this circulated, there's some documentation that, if it doesn't appear to be heavily stained, you can still use it. Well, I can tell you in a court of law, I would not accept that, because what did we just learn? You have to have a smooth, intact surface in order for the instrument to be cleaned and sterilized appropriately. You can't tell that by looking at it. You can't tell what's underneath that stain, if the surface is corroded or not. So how can you say it's safe, or we don't have enough of a stain to do it? I think you're playing with fire when you do that. And that's why it is so critical that sterile processing not send those instruments to the OR in the first place, because it just creates havoc. And that could be your, your justification for getting more instruments. Saying, look, we have to send them because we don't have anything else. Believe me, you know how that jury would be told? They're too cheap. They don't want to spend the money. And that's why you got an infection. Dear Lord, that would be horrible.
Well, I think it's
that's how it would be prevented.
I think it's very safe to say, when you have a staining or spotting issue, it's not a sterile processing. It's sterile. It's not just a sterile processing issue or an operating room issue. It's also infection control, risk management issue, and it's also an administration issue. Yeah. Because the doctors go to administration and they want answers and they want why delays, why this. And I think what is the worst thing, which happens constantly, is the lack when when cases start getting canceled because of spotting and stating, and then the operating room gets frustrated, and they go out sterile processing, and the sterile processing starts firing back at the operating room, and then
Yeah.
I also see when there's that kind of tension, the sterile processing staff starts clashing with their management, and then management starts clashing with the staff. Then administration hears about it and they come down and they do their, they'll walk through, and then the sterile processing staff just floods administration with all these my manager's not doing this and the operating room is not doing that, and nobody's helping us, and and all the blame is just getting thrown all over the place.
Yeah.
When you're in this situation, it's everybody's problem. So soon as it starts happening, get everybody involved so that there is no surprises later in conversations. When I've literally been pulled by my OR director and by administration in my office that said, like, your staff said you didn't educate this, or you didn't give them that, or you didn't buy this. And it was stuff that I did, and luckily enough documented that I did, that, I had the records of buying it. I had the records for this in services to prove it. But everybody just goes into attack mode to clear their name. It's teamwork.
Well, I think we're getting close to the end now. I think to summarize this, number one, if you're having a problem with spotting and staining, because it impacts on so many departments, form a subcommittee. Get quality assurance involved, risk management, because threats of a lawsuit, operating room, materials management, infection prevention, and sterile processing. And you work together as a team to find out the causes and the solutions. It's much easier when you have all of those departments involved, especially risk management, because they're taking the risk.
Yes.
They have to know the risks that are going on in the facility. It's much easier to resolve issues, and I know I've done it many times at facilities, and it really works rather than just OR and SPD trying to do it by themselves.
Yes.
So you have to identify the problems, or at least identify you have a problem, then get everybody together and come up with a game plan how you're going to go through, using ST 108 as your guide, and also using good quality assurance procedures to go through step by step and identify the causes and how to resolve them.
Yeah, and that's the gist of it. I'll tell you, in this conversation, again, everybody, this is always going to be a conversation, but you're going to get a lot of education, and you're going to see Nancy and I, we're having a conversation. So we're going to grab drinks, we're going to have coughs, and this is not formal, CEU conversation, but I'm still laughing at it. And it's funny, but it's not funny. There was a part in this where you said something about us having our own quality time at home. And all I could think about was all the listeners going, who gets quality time at home from work to, work and family life? It's always like when you worked in sterile processing or an operating room, it never shut off. And quality
That's what I meant by that. I mean, everything, and we don't even get to do that. But if you take care of your problems, then you will have time that you don't have to worry every time the phone rings when you're at home.
Yep. I used to say, because I would have leaders tell me, well, you're going to be here for like 10 hours today, right? And I'd be like, maybe 9, because if I can't manage this in 9 hours, then I shouldn't be managing it at all. If it can't go on without me, then I can't be here 24/7. So yes, that is very important. I definitely want to thank anybody that, the listeners. This is our first, so we'll see who the listeners are. I believe our next one is education, which will be bi-weekly. So this is airing on the 16th. So I should have that number right here, but of course I don't. And I'm going to say the 16th. And then the next one will be on March 3rd, which right now everything is going to either be on, everything's going to be on our YouTube channel. And also, I believe we're posting it on our company's website, or no? I can't remember.
Yes, it is www.spdceus.com.
Okay. Yep. And at the end of this, I'm going to have a nice little list of uh, we have X, we have Instagram, we have TikTok, we have um, YouTube, we have Facebook. So I'm going to put a little nice thing at the end to give you all that ways to contact us if you have any questions, or especially if you need resources, books and educational stuff. Sterile Processing University has tons of things to offer for educational, not even just for sterile processing. We also have it for endo, and we also have it for dentists, for dentistry, which is another whole subject that we're going to tackle somewhere along the way. And even if you're not in the dentist world and you're just a sterile processing person, when we get to that point, you should really listen, because it is going to be mind blowing.
Jason, is there any way we're going to be getting feedback on our podcast? Because that'll really help us as we prepare, as we go through.
Correct. So definitely everybody on the especially on the with Sterile Processing University and the YouTube channel, please comment. Always hit subscribe so that you can get any kind of videos or information we put out. And please give us any kind of feedback. We would really appreciate it. Nancy and I definitely have a schedule of what we want to do for a couple of weeks, but I guess after a while, we are going to really want to see what people want to hear and deliver that to them. But, first we're going to get out what we need to get out. But I want to thank everybody. Nancy, thank you. This is my favorite boss of my life. So I love working for her. And
I love working with you too, Jason.
This was,
we'd have the same wavelength.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you for watching.
Thank you, everybody.